Hey y'all, Melissa here with you today, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to sew faster. I've been sewing for a long time, and patience is not one of my virtues. So I've come up with many ways to get things done more quickly over the years that I've been sewing. Now, some of this is just practice. You can't do something quickly if you're not confident in your skills doing it. But once you get to that point, there are tips and tricks that I'm going to be sharing with you today to get things done more quickly. And I use these every year when I sew multiple sets of pajamas for my kids and their cousins so that we can take pictures of them together in their pajamas. All right, you ready for my tips? Here they are. Tip number 1, group your tasks. Cut everything out at once. Sew as many things as you can before you move back to pinning. Iron all the things that need to be ironed before you move back to the sewing machine. Group your tasks. Tip number 2, cut multiples. It is always faster if you're going to be sewing large numbers of an item to cut them all out at once and do it assembly line style. Cut all those multiples out. Even if it's not the same pattern, if you spend a whole evening cutting out different patterns and then the next day you can spend sewing and moving back and forth between the patterns, that's still going to end up being faster in the long run than if you cut out one entire thing, sewed the one entire thing, cut out the next entire thing. Tip number 3, use as few pins or clips as possible. And I actually, when I'm doing the kids' pajamas, I color coded and I wrote down labels for myself to remind me which color clips I was using for which kids' pajamas so that I don't mix up pieces, especially because I'm using the same fabric for all the pajamas this year. The fewer pins or clips you use, the fewer you have to worry about removing before you sew over that section of the pattern. Tip number 4. Minimize your movement back and forth between the stations in your sewing room. So if you look at this overhead picture of my studio, you'll notice that I have my machine set pretty close together and that I have an ironing station close to that. And so I'm not walking across the house every time I need to move to a different type of task. Now, you may not have that luxury in your space, and that's totally understandable, but if you do, set your stations up close together so that you don't have to move very much to get from one place to the other. Tip number 5, if you're sewing multiples and you're doing something like kids' pajamas like I am, consider using gray thread for all your interior seams. In general, this is a trick I learned from theater, people aren't going to see the thread color close up. And especially if it's something like for my kids, they're not even going to notice if I don't change thread colors. So if I just use gray thread for everything, then I don't have to change threads and it's a lot faster. Now obviously you don't want to do this on something where the top stitching or the seam stitching might be visible. And you definitely don't want to do this for top stitching necessarily. You do probably want to match your top stitching thread because that's more visible. But on the insides, I use gray a lot of the time. Tip number 6, chain stitch. What that means is when I'm grouping my tasks, I put everything that I can sew on one machine at one time all in a pile, and then I just keep picking up the next thing off of the pile and stitching it, and I don't cut the thread in between. I do this both on the sewing machine and on the serger, where I'm just feeding one seam after another through the machine, and then I bring them all back to the table and start clipping the threads in between them. Tip number 7, whenever possible, use flat construction instead of round construction. Let me show you what I mean. Here's an example of flat construction. I've sewed the front and back crotch seams on this pair of pants, and now all I have to do is refold them again, match up those crotch seams, and then I'm going to be stitching from one cuff all the way flat across to the other cuff. So it's just one long seam here. That's flat construction. I started with 2 pieces flat together. I folded them flat together. It's faster than round construction. Here's an example of round construction of pants. So I've got the right leg and the left leg sewn, and in order to put these together in the round, what I have to do is turn one of them right side out, and then I have to place it inside the wrong side out one. And then I still need to match those inseams and then match up the crotches. And what I will end up doing on this stitching here is I will stitch that leg, front crotch and back crotch together, and then I'll turn the legs right side out and I will have 2 legs. This is a little bit slower than constructing with flat construction. Tip number 8, get a rolling chair. A rolling chair is going to be useful because you don't have to get up to move from station to station. So if I'm moving from my serger to my sewing machine, I don't have to stand up and walk from one to the other. I can just roll my chair, and that saves time. Tip number 9, if your sewing machine has a knee bar, use it. If you're in the market for a new sewing machine, consider that as an option that may help you sew more quickly. A knee bar allows you to lift the presser foot without actually reaching back and pulling up the presser foot lever. And what that means is that you can keep your hands on your stitching, you can turn corners without moving your hands, and you can use your knee to just raise the presser foot whenever you need to. Some machines also have this option built into the foot pedal, and that can be another way to save time because you're not picking up your hands from what you're doing to move that presser foot lever and then putting it back down. Tip number 10, my last tip, minimize your thread changes. If you are matching your thread to the insides because you just can't stand to use gray on everything, or if you're top stitching, you want to chunk everything that needs the same thread color to go in one pass so that you're not constantly changing threads. If you have more than one sewing machine, sometimes it's worthwhile to go ahead and just set up 2 machines with different colored threads if you're going to be switching a lot and move back and forth between machines. Again, I realize this is a luxury to have more than one machine to sew on, but if you do, that's another thing that can make it go faster if you're using multiple thread colors. So, those are my 10 best tips to sew faster. If you'd like more sewing tips, check out this playlist that I'm linking here, and happy sewing!